Welcome to Spiritual Truths with your host, Kerry Marie. And I want to say thank you for being part of this podcast series. Obviously, you're investing in yourself and care about your mind, body, soul, and spirit. Today, I'm delighted to have with me Virginia Brooks. Virginia helps support the Soulless Group. It's a support group in Auckland to help with those that are affected with suicide and the bereavement that they go through. I'd love you to become part of this podcast series by subscribing. And if you have any questions, you can put comments below. Otherwise, you can email me, kerry@kerrymarie.co.nz, and I'll do my best to answer your question. Have a great day. Enjoy the podcast. Blessings and love, Kerry Marie. Yep. Hi there. I had a debrief with Virginia Brooks about death by suicide, and in the podcast it is Let's Talk About Sudden Death and Suicide. Unbeknownst to me, I brought a common phrase throughout the podcast about commit suicide. And Virginia kindly explained to me that that is not a term that is healthy to use anymore. And the reason being is that commit is like committing a crime, or in religious terms, committing a sin. So the right terminology to use is death by suicide. So you may see this term commit suicide come up in the podcast, and it was not the correct term to use. So just so you know, the right term is death by suicide. I hope you get something from the podcast because it's very insightful. Blessings and love, Kerry Marie. Welcome, Virginia. I'm looking forward to doing this podcast with you because I think we're going to be covering a very important subject, a difficult subject, but a really important one. So I first met you back in 2023. I work as a celebrant, so I am a New Zealand registered celebrant, so I officiate weddings and funerals, and I like doing ongoing education. So one came up and it was about difficult funerals. And it was lovely being amongst other celebrants. And then I really enjoyed your talk that you did, your presentation. I remember that very well about difficult funerals. And one of the things, the subjects and topics that you covered is suicide, which is a huge subject. In my work, in my capacity as a my spiritual work and as a capacity as a celebrant, I do deal with suicide, and it's tragic and very real and difficult for those that are left behind. So you can just tell us a little bit about you, because you help with suicide. You help support the Soulless, is it Foundation?
Soulless Group.
Soulless Group in Auckland to support suicide. Yeah. So you just tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this sort of work.
Well, lovely to be here with you today, Kerry Marie. And for listeners, kia ora, ko Virginia Brooks tuka wangawa. My name is Virginia Brooks. I'm an Aucklander born and bred, and I whakapapa back to Europe. Soulless. So it's Auckland's peer support group for suicide loss. It's a volunteer-run group. We're not counsellors, we're not specialists. We are simply people bereaved by suicide who run a peer support group for other people who are bereaved by suicide. We have had sort of guidance and support around safe ways to run the group. But it's Auckland's and probably New Zealand's longest running peer support group for suicide loss. Soulless has been going for good 15 to 16, maybe a bit longer, 18 years. It's been going for quite some time, and it's just a lovely place for people bereaved by suicide to connect and share their story and what their grief and loss means for them.
Right. So why did you end up joining this group? What drew you to that?
I'm bereaved by suicide myself. I discovered the group when I lost my son to suicide. Matt was 22 when he died, and he was struggling with mental health and addiction issues. And in the aftermath, after he died, someone told me about Solace. So I thought, well, I will give it a go. I had actually been along to a peer support group while Matt was still alive, and it was around addiction. It was a really good group for friends and family run by CADS, and I'd found that peer support group experience so useful there that, Solace made sense to me to go along.
Right, okay. So you've had quite a bit of experience with suicide personally. Have you done any training in it at all?
In my day job, I actually work as a health promoter and work in the suicide prevention and bereavement area, and I have had some training through that. But in addition to my son, I also lost my sister to suicide. So she died
Goodness.
of suicide a year after Matt. And yeah, it kind of really hit our family quite hard. And I think Solace was one of the things I found most important in supporting me through, and still supporting me through that experience. And because I just kept going to Solace, and now I'm part of the Solace committee and help run the group.
So the fact that you, obviously in your day job, you help people with suicide and loss. So you got experience from a professional capacity, but also you have this personal experience. So, it's all very well for someone to give you advice as a professional, but to actually have experience yourself must really, give this qualify you is what I'm hearing you, qualify you, and it must really help other people because you've been through experience what they're feeling.
I think, it's I wouldn't say I've experienced necessarily what other people are feeling, because grief
Right.
is so individual. Everyone is so different. Everyone's experiences, everyone's stories are just so different. But it's a similar experience, suicide
Similar.
loss for everybody. There are some similarities, and I think, but it gives you an ability to be in that space and hold that ground and just hold it and be there for others going through that. And one of the things I love about Solace is it's just, people aren't discriminating, there's no stigma, people are just open, they're listening to each other and holding that space for each other just to share their experiences. And there are so many different experiences that people have and so many different ways people feel
Yeah.
their loss and work through
Yeah,
that.
that's awesome. Actually, as soon as I said that, you would understand how they're feeling. I suppose that I do agree with you because as a celebrant and in my spiritual work, I do encounter suicide, and there is all different reasons for suicide, and everybody's individual, everybody's different. So really, our podcast is let's talk about sudden loss and suicide, and I feel that it's something that people are very awkward and don't like talking about it, do they? Not openly.
Very much so. There's still so much stigma around suicide. I think it's been such a
Yeah.
taboo topic for so long. I mean,
Yes.
not just New Zealand, but globally. I think we're very rusty about how to have those conversations. And I think too, people are often afraid to approach people when they're in grief, whatever the grief is, whatever the
Yes,
loss
they
is.
are.
But we kind of have a culture, I think, particularly in Western culture, where we silence grief and loss. It's not sexy, right?
No, it's not sexy.
No one wants to know about it. Well, that's not true that nobody wants to know. There are beautiful people out there that want to know, and there are people that hold the space. And then, honestly, every single human being on the planet experiences grief and loss. And if you haven't yet, you will at some point. And so it's it's a totally common experience. But yeah, it's just not an experience that we tend to talk about a lot.
No, we don't. We sweep it under the carpet. Actually, I had, it was Mary, I can't think of her last name. She was she taught me as a celebrant. And the thing I learnt from her, I went through my own grief after seeing her of past grief I hadn't dealt with. I did one through transition, through crisis, and I realised that I hadn't grieved properly and I'd kept it in. And one thing she said, and I see it all the time, and people that come and see me in a spiritual capacity tell me this, that people, they've lost someone, and our society deals with it by zipping it up. And they'll say, even if someone's elderly and they die, they'll say, oh, well, at least they had a good life, or they're in a better place. Or they say, and with suicide, I don't know what they'd say, but they'd say the wrong things. And then rather than supporting them and being there with them and sort of having a conversation about it. And it's hard, but I think one of the good things is to say that a good thing you could say to people forgive me if I got this wrong, is how does that make you feel?
Yeah,
Is that a good statement to say?
I think so. And don't be
Yeah.
afraid to talk to someone bereaved, whether it's by suicide or someone else, but
Yeah.
something else. But particularly, I think there is, and there's even research they've done on the suicide bereavement experience, and they found that people who are bereaved by suicide receive a lot less support from other people. People do find it really hard to talk to them. I think because it's that thing about suicide that scares people. And so yes, if you have someone bereaved by suicide in your life, don't be afraid to talk to them and just go, hey, how are you traveling? How's it going?
Yeah, how are you coping with that?
Yeah.
And be really, really authentic, because the whole thing about people closing you down and sort of say, oh, well, they're in a better place, or oh, well, we're going through a hard time, or they could have said, couldn't you have stopped that? I imagine that could be something they could say, all sorts of things. I don't know. But all it does is, I remember when my mum passed, it wasn't a suicide, but she died of cancer. No, it was my dad, sorry, it was my father, and he died of cancer. I was quite young, I was in my 30s, and dad died, and I was really upset. And I spoke to someone, they told me that I was a mean person. They said, you're such a mean person.
It's awful.
Yeah, because your poor father was in such a bad place, and you shouldn't be upset about it. And it just made it worse. It just made it worse.
That shouldn't happen.
Yeah, and even with my husband, when his father was early 90s when he passed, and he said the worst thing for him was when people said, oh, well, they had a good life. He's had his father in his whole life, through his whole life, and he died sort of very quickly at the end. Why isn't he allowed to grieve this whole life of losing a father?
One of the things I find really
Yeah.
interesting in grief is
Yeah.
in the 90s, this theory came out about grief, and it's great. It's called continuing bonds. So it's this
Yes.
idea that
Yeah.
even if a person has died, but we are still in relationship to them. So my son is still my son, my sister's still my sister. I still have conversations with them, or I'm not necessarily talking about in a spiritual sense, but it's for us in the living that we're still in that relationship, and we still have things in that relationship from a psychological point of view to work out, and that relationship still has meaning to us.
Yes.
So that wanting to connect, that that still feeling that pull of that relationship, even though they're not in the living, it's normal, it's natural, and it's no one should ever feel shamed of feeling grief, or no one should be shamed into feeling like, aren't you over it yet? Like,
I know,
can you stop talking about it?
I
Like,
know.
of course you want to talk about it. Of course you still feel it, because guess what? You're still that person's someone, and to you that
Yes.
relationship is still as alive as ever, even if the
Yes.
person is no longer in the living.
Yeah.
So in grief theory, it's seen as really important, that continuing bond, and it's seen as very okay to want to be in connection with that person.
Oh, great. I love that. Of course. I love that. Okay. So, what I'm going to go through and say is, what is your advice for someone experiencing sudden loss or suicide loss? Like, even just sudden loss, because sometimes people die in a car accident or suicide or a heart attack. We'll start off with sudden loss to start off with, then we'll go to suicide. So, what's your advice for experiencing sudden loss?
Sudden loss, I mean, that's so tough, because shock. I remember when my son died, and I was so in shock that I couldn't even take it in. It was my sister who
Yes.
actually had to tell me that he had died, and died of suicide, and I couldn't. I had to keep asking her to repeat it, and then I said to her, "This is not a joke. This is not funny." Because and she's like, "I'm not joking. This has happened." I could not
Wow.
take it in. And that's shock. And so
Right.
sudden loss, shock is a real common thing, and it really affects your the way you're present with that loss.
You're not expecting it. You're not
Expecting
prepared.
it.
You're not
You're
prepared.
not, and it just tips everything upside down. The whole nature of everything just goes upside down, and the world doesn't feel real anymore. That was my experience, but
That's quite usual. That's quite
quite
normal.
usual.
That's
Yeah,
quite normal. Yeah.
because you're like, oh my god, nothing is the same. Nothing will ever be the same. And
No.
yeah, so that sudden loss and shock is huge, and it's very much take it moment by moment, take it one day at a time. If you're in shock and you've had a sudden loss like that, get support around you, have a support person with you, because
And the right person.
and the right person, because in that immediate aftermath, you might have things to do, like letting other people know that this person has died, or organising a funeral or tangi or farewell, and you're going to want some support around you, because you're going to forget things.
Yeah.
You're going to people are going to give you contact details and numbers and tell you who they are, and you're going to look at them and nod, and it's just not going to go in.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I understand. Yeah.
Having some support around you to help organise what needs to happen going forward, but also to keep an eye on you. So as part of that shock, are you able to sleep? Are you getting some water? Often people can't eat when they're in that immediate
No.
shock, and you don't have to eat that much. You don't, for a few days, really.
Yeah.
You don't have to.
Yeah.
But drink liquid. Don't get short on fluids. Things like
That's
that.
That's a good idea. And also like those sippy bottles. So I've got a nice Frank Green one, and I love this because I think it goes back to being a baby. Like soft teat, and I think like a sippy bottle could be quite comforting.
Yeah.
And time of grief.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
comfort in that shock is important. Like, it sounds funny, but some people find being wrapped in a blanket really helpful.
Yeah, like going back to the infant
Yeah.
baby thing, that the sipping and the comfort.
That comfort. The reality is nothing fixes it, especially in those early days, because that grief is just so raw. Your world is so turned upside down, and it's just so unexpected, and it stops everything.
I'd be very
its
careful who I
tracks.
spoke to. Because you can't avoid that though, because some people
sometimes you
some people
can't.
can come back with the wrong statements.
Yeah, they can. And I think there are probably most people out there who have experienced grief and loss can probably relate to that.
Oh, definitely, definitely. The other thing is that comes to mind when you're talking is guilt, and sometimes that's why I always think that having unfinished business, like having arguments with your loved one, and it's almost like I feel that you almost need to be aware that you may never see that person again. You just don't know what can happen in life, and it's like
Right.
when they're going away, going off somewhere, like those unfinished business, because that I find in my spiritual work, that's something, even as a celebrant, a capacity to celebrate, it's like the guilt from unfinished business. What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I think guilt is one of those things that can particularly come up around suicide. It's one of the things that can make dealing with suicide loss really difficult.
Yes.
I was talking to someone about this the other day, though, and they said, I don't see it, that this was someone who had lost their brother to suicide, and she said, I don't so much see it as grief, as guilt, but I like the idea that I frame it as questioning. And she said, I think it's important to question that experience. And again, looking at some of the research around suicide loss, that questioning is very common after suicide loss, and it's okay to do, but it's also part of how your brain has to start coming to terms with what is happening, because suicide is what
Right,
they call a
yeah.
particularly incomprehensible type of death. It's a form of self-violence. Someone has seemingly done this to themselves, which, they have done it to themselves, but it's not a choice as we would normally understand choice. And for the people left in the living, you have to come to terms with it. And that questioning and the what ifs is another way to frame guilt. And,
Yes.
what if I had just done this? What if I had just done that? And it's very common, and it's okay to have those questions after someone has died, and it really is part of the experience. I would say if somebody's finding that is becoming an overwhelming thing, that they're getting consumed with feeling guilt or the what-ifs, do get support for that. Talk to someone you trust, or contact a professional counsellor. There is we're so lucky in New Zealand, we have a suicide bereavement counselling service, which is free for people bereaved by suicide, Āki Te Rā. I think at the end we're going to mention resources again, and I think
Yes.
Kerry Marie's got somewhere she can put
Yeah.
links for resources, but fabulous suicide bereavement counselling service. And I think if you're finding that questioning and that guilt is becoming overwhelming, which it can do, people can sometimes find it really hard to get on with normal life when they're down that rabbit hole. If that's happening for you or anyone you know, do get that extra support, because it's tough, it's hard, and I've been there. It's
Can be
can
overwhelming.
become, yeah, it can become
overwhelming.
rumination. There's a word for it, rumination, where you're
ruminate,
ruminating because you just cannot
move past it.
shift. And it can be a very dark place to be, and I've experienced that myself, rumination over my son's death and what didn't I do, what could I have done better, what a terrible mother I was, all these things. It's natural, it's part of that experience.
Yeah, absolutely, especially as a mum.
Yeah, but then I found the only way to shut my brain up and turn that off, because I suddenly would recognise I was down this dark rabbit hole and it wasn't a good place to be. I would just have to go to bed and sleep it off.
Right.
Because I just had to shut my brain off. I had to no, we cannot do this. This is not good. This is not healthy. This is not...
It might be hard to sleep though.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate. I did manage to get off to sleep, but I know some people struggle with getting off to sleep as well. And then in that case, reach out and chat to someone you trust. And, free helplines. Call a free helpline. Have a good chat.
So sudden losses.
Find a way to change the track.
So we go back to suicide. So sudden loss is one thing, but suicide, like you lose someone by sudden loss. But what about suicide? I mean, that must be just... unbelievable, like you said, unbelievable. It's a different thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
altogether?
It's a really difficult thing to comprehend. It's I think there are a lot of myths out there around suicide, and one of those myths is that a person chooses to die. But the thing with suicide is sometimes people who die by suicide are mentally ill. It can be quite a common part of a person being suicidal is mental illness, and sometimes that's diagnosed and known, and sometimes it's not diagnosed.
Right.
And people may not realise, and the person themselves may not have realised that they were ill, but it can happen quite acutely.
Right.
But sometimes people die of suicide and they're not mentally ill necessarily. But if a human brain is experiencing suicidality, there's likely processes of what they call cognitive distortion going on. And they've looked at this in research and done research with people who have had suicide attempts and survived to look at what was really going on for them and going on in their brains at the time they attempted. And so that cognitive distortion is a real thing, and it people's brains are literally not telling them the truth, and people are looking for a way to stop pain, end pain, and their brain tells them it's got a solution. So people aren't people aren't necessarily seeking to die as we would normally think of dying, but rather seeking an answer to pain, and their brain seems to have given them a solution.
I see.
So it's not choice, suicide, as we would normally understand choice.
I understand. So there's a real judgment around it, isn't there?
A lot of judgment. And sometimes you'll hear that myth that they were selfish. How could they do that? What a selfish person. How could they hurt their family by killing themselves? And people don't... Part of that cognitive distortion is that people can't connect with... things they could normally connect with. So those supports that they might connect with easily if they were well, or future events that they're looking forward to, that you can easily connect with that idea of future when you're well. But if a brain is suicidal, future thinking becomes really difficult. In fact, probably impossible. And some of the research suggests that the future thinking stops altogether because a person's brain is at that point, so cognitively distorted, that's literally like a black box that the brain can't see out of.
Interesting. Because I know someone...
So it's not about selfishness.
So sometimes someone may be an adult, have children, and they take their life. And people, someone's mentioned to me, how would they do that because they've got children? But what's your thoughts about that?
When my sister died, she was a mum. She was a fabulous mum, such a good mother. Loved her children very much. But she was experiencing extreme cognitive distortion, and she thought she was a horrible person. And she thought she was doing a good thing for her family, for all of us, by dying. Right. She thought that she was the problem. She was removing herself, and it would be better for everyone if she wasn't here. And that's cognitive distortion.
Is it? Wow. So someone watching this could have suicidal thoughts, and what would you be like thinking like that? I'd imagine they lost all hope, and they're thinking, they probably told themselves, I'm better off if I wasn't here. I imagine that could be quite a common thought. So would you suggest somebody had these sort of thoughts?
It's important to know that our thoughts don't always tell us the truth.
Right.
Get support. Talk to someone you trust. That might be a friend, might be a family member, might be a health professional. But ultimately, seek help from a health professional would be my advice, because something is going on for you, and
it's real.
you
What you're
need
feeling
that
is real,
help.
and you're suffering, They're really suffering, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, it's so complex, suicide, and how we think it can be so complex. There's no one size fits all.
Yeah,
And
exactly,
then,
because there's different reasons for suicide, isn't
yeah,
there?
there are different reasons for suicide, and it's incredibly complex. And in fact, we see it one way in the Western world, but you go outside the Western world, and in some countries, and historically, there have been cultural categories of suicide, like samurai, where it was great honour to die that way, or kamikaze pilots, or
Right, okay, I see what you mean. I
in
see
some
what you're
Indian
saying.
religions, it's very
Yes,
much
yes.
a devotional practice to
Yeah, so
to die
that's a different form
of your
altogether.
own
Yeah.
volition. Yeah, there are different ways that people can die and of suicide, and there's no. And I think it's a deeply philosophical issue too. Like for humanity, we can conceptualize being alive, and we can conceptualize taking life. I mean, when soldiers go to war, they know they're going to war to
Right.
take life
Yes.
as part of what they do, not necessarily all of what they do, because peacekeeping is a huge role that armies can play too. But yeah, I think suicide goes to the heart of what it is to be human and what it is to be here and to be alive, and it doesn't fit in a box easily.
It doesn't
It's
fit.
not, and it's not an easy to
Yeah.
solve.
So there can
thing.
be, I'd say there's mental health problems. There could be chemical problems, chemical imbalances,
Possibly.
hereditary. Also, it can be impulsive, do you think? Is it
I
can be
think
impulsive? Yeah.
it's there's a lot of research that goes on around suicide. So impulsive is one of those things that is what it can look like. But when they look at it in the research, there is some research that suggests that possibly there was a background that just wasn't obvious, so it's not as impulsive as it necessarily seems.
See, so it may appear impulsive
To
but
us, it
wasn't.
looks impulsive, but possibly,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it's so complex, suicide, and it's so complex, a human brain.
Yeah, it is very much so. Is that why sometimes you talked about the brain's always looking for a solution,
Yeah,
to try and get away that pain, and that's sometimes where addiction can come in because people, the brain's trying to, because our body's always trying to come back to homeostasis, aren't we?
yeah,
And so the brain's trying to make itself better, so the addiction relieves the pain. So they get caught up in addiction. That's how the brain also is trying to help you. The brain's actually trying to
yeah.
help you. And so that's why sometimes the people that plan suicide, people can't understand because suddenly they get really happy and then they do it. Could be because they've got the solution?
That's the thinking, again, when they look at it
Yes.
from the research and speaking with people who've been in that situation. Yeah, it's because they feel they've got an answer, and
But there is always help. There is always hope, even though they can't
there is
see
always
it.
help. There is always hope and connection. They're the number one ingredients in suicide prevention,
Right,
and
yeah.
so important. And there's sort of a myth out there that if someone has decided to die by suicide, it's inevitable, and that's just not true.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have that. I guess you have to have that caveat that it's not always easy to get help necessarily, but suicide is, in theory, preventable.
Right.
Always.
Preventative. That's a great thing to know. That's a great thing to know.
Yeah,
It really is. That's
because
wonderful.
it's about that hope, and it's about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. So what about for someone, I know people that are aware that their child's suicidal. I've had experience that with customers, and I've learned a lot over time that you should always get help. That's something I really learnt. But what would you advise somebody that knows somebody that's having suicidal thoughts or have that tendency? What would be the advice for someone? Like, it could be a parent, or it could be, you might be a child worrying about your parent, or it could be a friend or anyone. What would you suggest?
Exactly. Well, first of all, big ups to you for being in that space and having the courage to walk alongside someone experiencing suicidality. I know it's not an easy place to be. My own son, before he died, had a number of suicide attempts over a period of years, and it was incredibly difficult and hard to get help and support for both of us. Even though, help and support is out there, and there are stories every day of people around people who do get that help and support. So yeah, encourage that person to get help and support. Help them to get help and support. If they're seeing a GP and that GP doesn't get it or says, no, there's nothing to worry about here, go to another GP.
Right, get another,
Get advice from somewhere else. Like
second opinion.
Second opinion, and keep going back, keep seeking help, because help is there. And just, I guess, if you're supporting someone going through this, just keep being open to their experience and what it means to them. And seek support for yourself. That is super important. If you're supporting someone else, it's really important that you get some support.
Because it can be quite draining, couldn't it?
Can be draining, and you can be faced with some really difficult dilemmas along the way, or difficult situations. And it can become, I know in my own case, it could get quite overwhelming when I was trying to support my son.
Yes.
And I was trying everything, but getting professional support, going along and talking to people. I did quite a bit of that, trying to find people to talk to get advice, to get ideas, to get solutions, to try and understand what territory we were in and how could I keeping him safe.
So what about anger? Because imagine that in some such situations people could blame someone else, that they've committed suicide because of it's the other person's responsibility. So it's like that could happen as well, because I do see that in my work, that they blame, say if a partner dies, they blame the wife or the husband, or they could blame the parents or the father, or they're looking for blame because they say that person wouldn't do that. So how do you help with that situation? What's advice for if someone's been blamed or someone's been angry?
Yeah, I think the first thing to know is that suicide's incredibly complex. It's what we call a multifactorial issue, where many factors contribute towards a suicide, and we as other human beings, we don't have the power to cause suicide in somebody else.
Oh, so that's interesting. So we don't have the power to cause suicide in someone else.
We do not.
Oh, that's incredible. That's such a good statement. Why do you say that? Because I think people think that you do.
Yes. Yeah.
But you don't.
No, and there's never one thing to blame. So,
but why do you say, if I go back to the statement you said that another human has not got the power to cause suicide? Why is that?
Because it goes back to that multifactorial thing. There are so many factors in play that we can't cause it in somebody else. Like, we are just one part of the picture. So someone may well have had an argument or falling out, a disagreement, something might have happened, or there was nothing like that. I mean, I've seen it in some bereaved too, where they're very angry at the person who died. But anger is what we call an umbrella emotion.
Yes.
And you start to sit with that anger, hear it out, and then start to find out what's really going on underneath. And what's going on underneath is usually incredible grief and pain and loss. And sometimes it's just easier. Well, not easier, but sometimes feeling angry is... It's an emotion that can give us power, or give us a feeling of power in the moment, I guess, or make us feel like we're in control. Yeah, gets us out of bed and we're angry, and sometimes that just...
Reason for living.
And you know what? If that's what gets you through, well, ride the wave for a while maybe, but don't take it out on other people.
What about, say, someone's been attacked or blamed?
What's that?
Well, what if you're like the victim of somebody blaming you?
And that's shit. I mean, sorry, that's just not helpful. It's not helpful at all.
So what would you do? What would you advise?
I would remove myself from that conversation. I would say, respectfully, I'm going to go now. I can see you're upset. Don't stay to hear it, because it's just not helpful.
If it's somebody hounding someone, like, say it was a family situation, you could block them or something, couldn't you?
I think... that's one of the difficult and complicating things around suicide, is it often does pull families apart.
Yes.
Or
why
those dynamics around blame,
marriages and everything, they could fall apart.
Yeah, it's really one of those things that is often common around, or not necessarily common, but it's in that landscape of suicide loss that those questions of blame or anger or shame and pain really can push families apart. And people have different grieving styles too, and even that can cause real disruptions or ruptures in family structures where people have different grieving styles and maybe angry or criticise each other around the way that they're grieving even. It's
easy to do when you're in shock.
Yeah, shock. And people are in pain. It comes back to people being in pain.
I remember when our house got on fire. Our house actually got on fire. Long story. I had a bit of warning about it. But, yeah, I sort of reacted in an angry way. Yeah, and it didn't help.
Sometimes anger gives you the energy, right?
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. And it wasn't a good way. I realised later that was not a good way to react. Yeah, but it was my reaction because my daughter could have been killed.
Right.
Yeah, so that's how I reacted as a mum. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, anger has its place. It can be a useful emotion, but yeah, sometimes it is what we call an umbrella emotion, especially when it comes to grief and loss. And there's always something sitting underneath it. That's why it gets called an umbrella. Because some other emotions are sitting underneath it.
Right, and something unresolved.
Yeah, and there'll be other things going on.
Yeah, so one of the things they talk about a lot they talk about the stages of grief. What do you feel about that?
That was a theory, stages of grief, that
Yes.
it was really connected with Catherine Kubler-Ross. Fabulous.
That's right,
researcher and clinician, but her research was actually it wasn't around loss, it wasn't around suicide, but it was around the experience of dying. So she came up with this idea of stages people go through when they're in the experience of dying themselves. It kind of got co-opted into the grief space, and it kind of got accepted for a while there that there were these stages of grief. It's not the thinking anymore in grief theory. There are no such thing as stages. And our grief and loss will stay with us forever because it goes back to those continuing bonds. The person you love, you'll always love them. You'll always be in a relationship to them. Like, my sister's always my sister. My son is always my son. Nothing changes. I love them. They are to me as real now as they ever were.
How beautiful.
Yeah, and so in that sense, I will never get over the loss. But where in the early days of my loss, the pain was so overwhelming, it was so hard to get on with normal life, and it was just so big in my everyday. Now my everyday has gotten bigger, and so it's if you see it in the diagram, there's some great diagrams you see sometimes where you see grief as a circle or a ball.
Right, okay.
And that people think from the outside that as your grief lessens and time goes by, that ball of grief gets smaller. In actual fact, the ball of grief stays the same size, but your life grows and expands around it.
Right, I see. It's a good way of a good
Yeah, it's a lovely way to put it.
Yeah.
And there's also this concept of post-traumatic growth, where you go through a lot of trauma connected with grief and loss, but out of that there also come learnings,
Yes.
and you can grow and become more accepting, I think, of life, and more open to the loss and pain other people might be experiencing. And post-traumatic growth, I find I just so appreciate every day. Like, I get up every day and I'm like, even if it's shit, even if I don't feel good, but you get up every day and you're like, wow, I'm so lucky to be alive.
Yeah,
to
you
be here in this
appreciate.
moment. Yeah. And there might be terrible things going on in the world, but there's still, I don't know, a beautiful flower growing through the sidewalk. There's still somebody I walk past and they smile, or I just see some beautiful human interaction out there and I'm like, wow, that's really lovely. What a privilege. I'm here to see this.
It's really interesting because I nearly put a butterfly in here today, but I didn't. But one of the analogies we had when we were doing our training was, it's the analogy of a butterfly. So you're going along, you're the caterpillar, and then something tragic happens, some form of grief, and you go into this chrysalis, which is a mushy mess, and you don't connect. And that's what I say to people. It's like, the sun doesn't shine anymore. It could be a beautiful day. You could be in a crowd of people, you feel so alone and so down. It's like you just don't connect, and you go through the motions of life. You just go through the motion. You don't connect at all with anyone. And then when you're ready, one day maybe, you're going to come out and formulate this beautiful butterfly. their wings open up. How do you feel about that analogy? That's what I learned as a celebrant.
Right, yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm just thinking, I mean, you could be a brown and dingy moth, right?
Or a moth. It would be a beautiful butterfly. But anyway, you find your wings.
You find your wings, yeah.
That's expansion, I guess. I'm thinking about, like you're talking about the bubble and the expansion. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I think, again, I'd probably go back to that thing that grief can be so different for people and our experiences can be so different. And for some people, it might feel that way, and others it might feel quite different, and they might have other words to hold that or describe that. But I think for some people, that's an experience that would resonate.
Some people would, some people wouldn't. So it's a good way. So one of the things that people say quite often with grief, with suicide or any grief, is, it gets a bit less in time or better in time. What's your come back on that one? What do you feel about it? I don't like that saying.
No, and I think it's like I mentioned earlier, it's that thing that, your grief is ever with you.
Yes.
Because you will always love that person. And sometimes, I think as time goes on and it gets easier to live with your grief, but there are still times when it can come back and hit you really hard. Or, for example, on an anniversary or Christmas time, it's a time when people often struggle with their grief because those losses come back and you really miss that person.
Definitely, yes.
And that will be like that for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
But the rest of your life will get bigger. And I remember at the time after Matt died, I just thought, wow, I am literally never going to feel happy again. I will never feel joy again. I will never smile again. I really thought that was it for the rest of my life. And I kind of accepted that. I was like, yeah, joy is gone forever. But over time, it started to creep back. And actually, the first couple of times I laughed at a joke or something, I felt really guilty. I felt really bad.
A lot of people do.
Yeah, so weird. I felt guilty to be smiling because I'm like, he can't be here enjoying this. And it just felt so wrong. And
from a spiritual sense, I feel, whether you believe in the spirit world, which I do, or whether you don't, what I'd say from a spiritual aspect is that the spirit world will be so happy to see you smile and be happy. They'll be okay. That's what from the work spiritual work that I do, I'd say that anybody who's passed away and is still I think it's fabulous and an energy, they would think that's wonderful.
That's lovely to hear. I think that would be very comforting for a lot of people to hear that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny, grief and loss like that. Yeah, and I think I've spoken to other people bereaved who've had that experience too, of feeling guilty the first time, or that they smiled or laughed at something.
It's a wonderful thing.
It's a wonderful thing, and I think over time I kind of gradually started to be able to smile again and even laugh at something and connect and feel good and feel okay, and now I can do it completely normally again. But for a long time there, I just thought I would never, ever, ever, ever feel joy or happiness again.
So even logically, something I want to say, not even spiritually, but logically, if you go back to that person, wouldn't Matt or your sister want you to smile?
Oh God, yeah. Our family had a great sense of humour.
Yeah, and wouldn't they really, if they was alive, wouldn't they still want you to keep on living and having a good life?
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's a good thing to think about, isn't it?
It is a good thing to think about. And, it goes back again to continuing bonds. Our family has quite a sense of humour, and sometimes quite a dark sense of humour. And sometimes there are things that happen and I just crack up and start laughing. I go, oh my God, Kirsten or Matt, because I'm like, they would totally get it. And I know that they would be laughing because they would get it the way I got it.
Yes.
And they would laugh the way I was laughing because I'm like, oh my God, that's totally our family's sense of humour.
No one's ever said a moth to me before instead of a butterfly.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's quite funny. I was a bit taken aback when you said that. I think it's your I love dark sense of humour.
And I think it's part of that grief landscape too. You kind of develop an appreciation. I know even at our Solace group, people think, gosh, it's a suicide bereavement group. It must be a very sad group to be part of. But in actual fact, as part of that sharing, sometimes humour is shared, and sometimes it's black humour. And the whole group, we're in hysterics, we're laughing.
Yeah.
Because we all get it, and we're all like, oh my God, the absurdity of life or absurdity of the experience. And we genuinely all share a good laugh, which is, really good.
It's my friend's special birthday. She's got a really dark sense of humour. And, get those lovely inspirational cards. So I got her these dark humour cards. It was hilarious. It was like, who thought of 3 meals a day? What stupid person thought that? Is that, why can't I have 5? Or it's a real dark sense of humour. And she was just really cracking up.
Love
So that
that.
dark sense of humour is lovely.
It is. It
was
so
the-
goes to the heart of being human, you
Yes,
know?
it does, doesn't it?
Where we're
Yeah.
not perfect beings, and life is not like you say, 1, 2, 3,
No, it's not.
3 meals a day, 8 hours of sleep a
Yeah.
night.
Um,
Although 8 hours of sleep a night is healthy.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've covered a lot of things that we talked about here. Okay. Okay. What about people that are in denial? So, what about people that are in denial? So they'd say that person would not never do that. So this would have to be an accident. This has been caused by somebody else. It's like a form of denial.
I think that's complex when we're talking about suicide. So when somebody does die by suicide in New Zealand, and in a lot of countries, it's what we call a suspected suicide. And
Right.
there is an investigation process that has to take place. Police are part of that investigation, although suicide is not a crime, but it's about investigating, because when it's a sudden death of any kind,
Yes.
whether it's caused by illness or whatever, but it has to be, that cause has to be determined. And so a coronial process is part of
Right.
that.
Yeah.
The coronial process in New Zealand can take quite a long time. It can take
Right.
up to 3 years sometimes or longer. And so having a good understanding around why that person died is not always immediately apparent. And sometimes a death can be ambiguous. For example, when someone dies of a drug overdose, and you may have known that person was depressed while they were alive, and maybe suicide was something they spoke about. But when someone dies of a drug overdose, you don't know if it was an accident, an accidental overdose or a deliberate overdose. And so it's not always easy to know when a death is a suicide or not a suicide. So, and it's also hard. It's that thing that suicide is so hard to comprehend. It is hard to understand how it could happen. I mean, that's very much part of the landscape.
Right.
And I think
Okay.
it takes time. It takes
Yeah.
time to work through that. It also takes time to find all the pieces of the puzzle,
And
right?
justify it in their own minds as well. I'm hearing the word justify. For someone they've lost a loved one. For
Maybe not so much
suicide.
justify, but accept.
Accept. Okay.
I don't know if we ever justify it as such,
Right. Okay.
but it's learning to live with and accept.
Yeah.
And maybe to accept that you didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle and you didn't know everything that was going on for that person necessarily. And, sometimes after people have died of suicide, there are things that were happening in their life that people find out after they died.
Yes, I do.
You don't always have all the pieces of that puzzle straight away. And sometimes years go by and you still don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. And I think for people bereaved by suicide, it's very much part of that experience that you're always trying to put that puzzle together to find out what was going on for them. But you know what? You never have all the pieces.
I can't.
Certainly in my experience, it's something I've had to learn to live with, is not having all the pieces of the puzzle. And, I go back sometimes and I try to find missing pieces of the puzzle and try to find things to fit in and to understand why these deaths happened as they did. And
Accept the fact you'll never have all the answers.
yeah, and
But
it
it's
is that
norm-
process of learning to accept that I will never have all the answers.
But yes, I suppose it's a natural thing that your mind will do that.
Yeah. And it's part of why I started working in the area of suicide, because I was so like, damn you, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, get these answers around suicide. But what I've learnt working in the area is it's a very interesting area to work in. It's full of debates, it's full of tensions, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of research that still needs to happen. And it's one of those things. The more you know, the more you don't know.
Right,
So
I understand that. I totally get that.
yeah, I mean, we're talking about
Yeah.
human brain, human psyche, and
Yeah.
it's complex. And suicide is, again, it goes back to that thing. It's a multifactorial issue. There are so many factors that come into play if somebody is experiencing thoughts or actions around suicide, and it's just so complex.
So, and yeah, I say that as my work. I said the more I've got to do it, the less I know.
Yeah.
Accepting that it's really really complex as well. So, what about the other thing that happens? What about self harm? Is self harm? connected to suicide, or is it two separate things, or it can be? Or
It can be. Again, it's one of those areas that there's a lot of research goes on around that, and sometimes it can be. It's not always.
so what's the reason for self-harm, do you think?
Oh gosh, that's a complex.
People do cutting and things like that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, it's one of those really complex things, and there's no easy answer. There can be different reasons that someone is self-harming or engaged in processes around self-harm.
Can it be that sometimes, I remember I was going through I was heartbroken, and I was over in Rarotonga, and I came off a scooter, ended up in hospital. I was in terrible pain. But I remember saying to a counsellor, it actually sounds terrible, but it felt good to feel physical pain, and it felt easier to feel physical pain than it was to feel emotional pain at that time. I'm not suggesting it's a good solution, but do you think that could be one of the reasons?
There are people who have experience of self-harm and do talk about it in that way.
Right, okay.
They do feel that is, being able to feel that physical pain. It's
sort
a
of-
great
it's not-
way
it's
to
not-
help
not-
them handle emotional pain.
Yeah, it's not a healthy way to do it, but it's the first time I've experienced it. Like, who'd ever want to come off a scooter? But I never would want to do that again, because I went with my husband to Route 66, and unfortunately, lucky I was all gloved up, and we skidded in some metal. It's just because it was a difficult bike, and I came off like Wonder Woman. And I was waiting. I went right back to traumatic experience that the bike was going to fall on me, and I was waiting for the bike to fall on me because it did. It burnt me. But in over in Route 66, this big Harley had this special bar that stopped it from falling over. But my traumatic experience just went straight back to, it's going to fall on me now. Yeah. So I would never want that to happen. So the traumatic experience is there. I wouldn't want to go through it again. But at that time,
Yeah.
it's sort of I could relate to the physical pain more than I could the emotional.
Yeah, that's
And
really
my mind
interesting.
and my brain, yeah.
Yeah. And I think maybe that physical pain, it's easier to cope with in that moment maybe, or...
Yes. Yeah. But that could be one of the reasons for self-harm. And it could be linked to suicide, but not necessarily.
Not necessarily, and I think there are so many different types of self-harm and so many definitions of self-harm, and
That's true, actually. What is self-harm?
yeah, and you don't want to see it get used against people either, because maybe sometimes it can help people cope, or there are...
Well, that's the right way to
It's
cope.
complex.
Oh, that's the right way, but it's your brain trying to help, trying to take away the pain in some way.
Yeah, and it goes back to that thing, sometimes our thoughts don't tell us the truth, and it tells us, our brain can suggest things to us that, aren't necessarily helpful.
So why did your brain do that?
God knows. Part of being human. It's human. We're human.
Yeah.
Goes back to being human. And
Yeah. Okay. So what I was going to ask you, how does suicide statistics for New Zealand compare to other countries?
It's always a complex question. Suicide stats, and when you compare to different countries, every country counts stats slightly differently. So you're never comparing apples with apples.
Yes.
In fact, and when for a suicide to be counted as a confirmed suicide. So when a suicide death happens, it's a suspected suicide. So we keep numbers around suspected suicides. Once that death has gone through the coronial process and is finally, that process is finished, and then the cause of death is confirmed, then we have what was called a confirmed suicide death rate. Mm-hmm. So because that coronial process does take a while, does take a couple of years, our suicide statistics in New Zealand are always a couple of years old. So our most recent stats are for 2021 to 2022. And in that time, there were 538 people who died by suspected suicide in New Zealand. 538.
Why? Okay.
But that is less than what was reported for the previous year, which was 607. And again, in the 2019 to 2020 period, that was 628. So a little bit of a fall there in numbers. So we have a suicide numbers are going down a little bit at the moment, but from a statistical point of view, you can't count it as a trend until a lot of time has gone by.
Yes.
So at the moment, it's just part of a pattern which doesn't necessarily
indicate anything.
Doesn't necessarily indicate anything, and I think we can get very caught up on numbers. And I think the other thing to remember is that every single person who dies by suicide is a person who had family and whānau who loved them, and family and whānau who are hurting, and each person is not just a number, they're a real person, and each person has a story, and their whānau has a story, and I think that's what we need to remember.
Rather than statistics, yeah.
Yeah.
So what about notes? I meant to ask you about does everybody write it? Why do some people write notes
that
and
is
some
a myth.
don't?
Another myth. Another myth.
Interesting.
Not everybody writes note. In fact, when they look at the numbers around suicide notes, they guesstimate about 40% might leave a note behind.
Wow.
And sometimes it can drive people nuts, that idea that there's going to be a note. And you know, we hear about people bereaved tearing the house apart to find a note, which they can't find. The other thing that is
because it is a myth, because people expect there's going to be a note.
Yes, there's going to be a note, and it's going to have some tidy answer in that note, and those notes never do contain tidy answers, or very rarely. Sometimes people, when there are notes, sometimes people have written them when they're very, very unwell. And those notes may or may not make sense.
Yes, it's the other thing is they're very unwell so you can't take it to heart.
Exactly, and even if they weren't known to be mentally unwell, but again, those processes of cognitive distortion and yes, you really have to take those notes with a grain of salt.
And there's no shame to feeling suicidal, is there? Someone is suicidal.
Absolutely no shame, and that's part of that stigma is that that shame. And I think especially in New Zealand and Australia, our suicide stats are quite similar, but we also share this colonial history. And as part of that experience of colonialism is that idea that we should be strong. And we should pull up our bootstraps and don't show emotion. And
interesting.
Yeah, and so we have a lot of shame around suicide, a lot of shame around mental health, a lot of shame around that process, that perception that we're somehow not coping or how we should be coping, how we should be seen to be in the world.
Yeah, because mental health's like that too, isn't it? Like the physical health is one thing, but mental health is a really hard thing to own up to.
Yeah, as well, because that perception that we should always be staunch and onto it and know what we're doing.
Do you think it's got better? Do I think people are more open to mental health now?
I think so. I think that conversation is really starting to change, and that understanding is starting to change, which is really good to see.
Yeah, I love the fact that it is actually. It's wonderful. All right, so I'll just finish off by a couple more things. So, first of all, if someone's suicidal, where do they go again? Just as a reminder.
Yeah, talk to someone you trust, talk to a friend, talk to a mate, talk to a family member, but go to a GP, get some support.
Mm-hmm. And get referred. And there's free help around, isn't there?
Yeah, and if you're supporting someone you suspect is suicidal, if you're worried about someone, don't wait for them to tell you. That idea that people are going to reach out, because people don't always reach out or can't always reach out, but it's really important to be able to reach in. So reach in, say to someone.
That.
Yeah, reach in and say, hey, Kerry Marie, I've noticed, you just seem really down lately, and you've started to talk about wanting to die. Like, you're right.
Yes.
What's going on?
Yes. I like that because you talk about reach out. We don't do reach in.
Yeah, reach in. Don't wait for people to reach out, but reach in.
Yeah, I always remember years ago, I was actually quite sad. I was about 18. I was looking after my friend's baby. I just had a wheelchair, and I was just feeling really sad about a relationship. I felt quite down. But I wasn't suicidal. And I was just there. And this lady came rushing out of the car, and then she said, "Are you okay?" That was lovely.
Yeah.
Just reach out. I remember another time when I was struggling as a single mum, and I had $1 to get to vacuum my car at a garage, and I went in to the shop, and this man said, "You look really tired. I'm going to buy you a cup of coffee."
Wow.
Oh my God, there was a guy behind the counter. I couldn't believe it. I just burst into tears.
Gosh, that's lovely.
Then I saw him at the supermarket all the time. I just thought, what a wonderful person. I'll never forget it.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful and simple way just to support others, eh?
Yeah.
We don't always know what each other's going through or what's going on for someone else.
But it's so much to me.
But just that beautiful little compassionate moment of reaching out. And
there's another time I remember feeling quite down because I found love my children, but being a mum on your own was quite difficult. And I said to my friend, I've got to go and see a doctor because I'm feeling quite down. And she said, okay, I'll come babysit. You know what she did? She came and tidied up my pantry and tidied up the rooms. And I didn't need to go and see a doctor.
Wow. Love that.
Just she gave me the practical help and suddenly, I'm fine now.
Yeah.
Just had that support
Yeah.
and doing something practical for me.
Yeah, that really means a lot. And there's
Yeah.
a great way to reach out and support someone.
Let's do something practical because I can't do it for themselves. That practical support's amazing. So then what I'm going to ask you is, because it is spiritual truth, so everybody has some sort of spiritual truth. Well, it could be different things. Some people say medicine's there, foods are medicine and nature's their spiritual truth. What's your spiritual truth?
I hold space for uncertainty, for not
Wow.
having the answers and for not knowing. I know when my son died, I'm a mum. I wanted to know where he was. I wanted to locate him in space and time. It's one of these things that, you just want to know where your person is and are they okay. And I really went on this quest to figure out, was there an afterlife or not? And this took months, and I eventually came to the conclusion that I didn't know. I would never know. How could I even know? I'm only human. I mean, I was brought up going to church, right? So I was brought up to believe there was an afterlife. But then I went to university and science says, God, no, that's not true. So I was like, is there or isn't there? And I decided I just hold space now for uncertainty. I don't have the answers. I don't know if there is an afterlife or not, if there's anything after this. There may not be anything at all. And you know what? That's okay.
Right.
And if there is an afterlife, that's okay too.
Right. Okay.
I don't know.
Fair enough.
And that's my spiritual truth, just holding that space for uncertainty.
Uncertainty.
And not knowing.
Yeah. We know how I feel about that.
Yeah.
I'm absolute that there is.
And I'm happy for you.
Oh, no, truly. That spiritual side of me, it just gives me so much joy and passion and hope. And
right.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. And the joy that I can bring to others as well. But at the same time, I think in the work that I do, I have to respect other people's choices. And I think you can't make somebody, but one thing I found about my work that I do, you cannot make somebody else believe. It's actually, because to me, it's a knowing, and I feel that knowing is different than a belief. And I'm in that knowing place.
Way, right?
Yes, I'm in a knowing place, but otherwise you have to believe what someone else tells you.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I think they've given great rejoices. They've given great resources, given a lot of hope. It's okay for people to smile. It's okay to feel shame. There's always help. There's always love. There's always support.
Yes.
So once again, thank you, and help for supporting our listeners as well. Blessings and love.
Thank you, Kerry Marie.
Thank you.